Hi, this is Andrew Francis, and as we continue on our series of studies on Isaiah, we'll be looking at Isaiah chapter 5 today. I begin by reading Isaiah 5 verses 1 to 7. Let me sing for my beloved, my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. And he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. It shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but behold bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold an outcry. If you can imagine the setting, the prophet Isaiah is talking to a crowd of people from Judah. Like Jesus telling a parable, or like Nathan the prophet telling his story to King David, the people understood very clearly what is being spoken of. Many would have known intimately the process of preparing land to plant vines. They would have found a fertile plot. With much hard work, they would have removed all the stones from the land, using those very same stones to build a wall around their property to keep out the marauding animals. And once the land had been cleared and the vines planted, any leftover stones would have been used to build a watchtower in the middle of the property, from which the owner or someone appointed by the owner could keep an eye on the vineyard that's growing there and make sure the vines grow without disturbance. After the land has been cleared, the walls built, the vines planted, and the tower built, the owner would have dug 2 vats into the rock. One vat would be higher than the other, and the grapes would be pressed into it. The juice would flow through an opening into the second vat below, where the juice would be allowed to settle. Now, as you can imagine, this was all a very labour-intensive process, and the owner expected to be able to enjoy the hard work of his hands. But instead of finding good quality grapes on its vines, the owner discovers wild, unusable grapes. And so Isaiah would have looked at his listeners, and he would have asked the obvious question, what will the owner do with such a vineyard? What more can he do? And more than likely, in the culture of the time, the listeners would have shouted out their responses from where they were standing. Tear down the vineyard. Get rid of those useless grapes. Start again. Let the animals eat them. And like David reacting angrily to the prophet Nathan's story of the poor man with one lamb that had been taken by a rich man to feed his guests, the people would effectively judge themselves by their responses. It's lovely to hear Isaiah refer to God in verse 1 as my beloved. It's an expression of great intimacy. And unlike the Song of Solomon, the beloved is not the woman, or as in some prophetic passages, the people of God, but God himself who is being referred to. As the people respond to Isaiah's story, Isaiah backs up his message, letting them know that they are the vineyard that God is judging. And further to this, as God's vineyard, which has failed to produce fruit in keeping with God's character and expectations, they will experience the fate of the vineyard. God will remove his protection from his people, allowing the grapes to be eaten and the vineyards to be trampled down. He'll remove all the provisions and the blessings of rain. Useless plants will grow up in the vineyard, choking the life out of the vines. And in other words, Isaiah is putting into a poetic story the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem at the hands of rampaging armies and invading forces. This will be the consequences of their uselessness. So let's continue Isaiah chapter 5 verse 8 to 17. Woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field, until there is no more room, and you are made to dwell alone in the midst of the land. The Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing, surely many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitant. For 10 acres of vineyard shall yield but 1 bath, and a homer of seed shall yield but an ephah. Woe to those who rise early in the morning, that they may run after a strong drink, who tarry late into the evening as wine inflames them. They have lyre and harp, tambourine and flute and wine at their feast, but they do not regard the deeds of the Lord or see the work of his hands. Therefore my people go into exile for lack of knowledge. Their honoured men go hungry, and their multitude is parched with thirst. Therefore Sheol has enlarged its appetite and opened its mouth beyond measure. And the nobility of Jerusalem and her multitude will go down, her revellers and he who exalts in her. Man is humbled, and each one is brought low, and the eyes of the haughty are brought low. But the Lord of hosts is exalted in justice, and the holy God shows himself holy in righteousness. Then shall the lambs graze as in their pasture, and nomads shall eat among the ruins of the rich. Isaiah now explains the reason why God's judgment is coming. He's explaining what the wild fruit of the vineyard is. The first fruit evident among the people is greed. In Torah, the people of Israel were all allocated land. This land was actually God's land, and the people acted as God's tenants. Every 50 years, if the land had been sold to others, it was meant to be returned to the original owners. This was part of God's way to ensure equity and to make sure that the poor simply didn't get poorer and the rich didn't just keep on acquiring wealth. On the 50th year, crops were not meant to be planted, and it was an opportunity for the land to regain its health. Now there's little evidence that Israel ever actually lived out this law. And so the year of Jubilee remained a lovely idea rather than a lived out reality. Instead, as the rich made more money, they would purchase more property and build larger houses, ultimately forcing the poorer people from what little land they had and gave them no opportunity ever to return their property to them. God's judgment will mean that even the rich will lose their houses and land, and the whole land will be unoccupied. Finally, the land will be able to rest. The judgment reminds me of the parable in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 12, verse 13 to 21. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to me, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I'll do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." So not only will the land be laid to rest, but it will also no longer produce the abundance and the wealth that has previously produced. In verses 11 to 12, we are told that another wild fruit is drunkenness and debauchery. Instead of wealth producing thankfulness to God and generosity, it has produced greed and drunkenness. The wealth is a means by which the rich can party and close their eyes and hearts to the needs of the poor around them, and also any message or work of God. And in verses 13 to 15, Isaiah explains that despite all the wealth and prosperity, there is a deep hunger and thirst for something more. They might have God's laws, but they have no real knowledge of God. If they did, their lives would evidence God's love, mercy, and justice. But the sad reality of all this acquisitiveness and self-protection and power grabbing is that as multitudes go down to Sheol, the world of the dead, they will all end up in a similar position to one another. The rich man and the ruler will be treated with the same indignity and shamefulness as the poor people that they have spent their lives looking down upon and despising. And again, this reminds me of another parable from Luke's Gospel, chapter 16, verse 19 to 31. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, 'Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame.' But Abraham said, 'Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things, but now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides this, between us and you a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. And he said, Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. And he said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they'll repent. He said to him, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. God's holiness is evidenced in the justice and the righteousness of his people. But now animals will graze on the former land of the wealthy, and nomads who don't even live in houses but tents will wander among the ruins of the mansions of the rich. So Isaiah tells us. And so Isaiah continues in chapter 5, verse 18 to 25. Woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of falsehood, who draw sin as with cart ropes, who say, Let him be quick, let him speed his work that we may see it. Let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw near, and let it come that we may know it. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight. Woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink, who acquit the guilty for a bribe and deprive the innocent of his right. Therefore, as the tongue of fire devours the stubble, and as dry grass sinks down in the flame, so their root will be as rottenness, and their blossom go up like dust, for they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts, and have despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against his people, and he stretched out his hand against them and struck them, and the mountains quaked, and their corpses were as refuse in the middle of the streets. For all this his anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. In this next section we are introduced to the fruit of cynicism. The people have become so numb to God and his ways that they have little hesitation to challenge the prophet Isaiah and tell him, If what you say is true, and we highly doubt it, then bring it on. May God do his worst. We just don't care at all. Not only this, but in their arrogance, which is the 4th fruit, they assume that they have the power to determine right from wrong. If they don't think something is wrong, then they will simply say, it's good. And both of these things are so prevalent, sadly, in my own culture and country. People have no hesitation in declaring things God has said is sin to be good and right, and to proclaim that anyone who says that they are wrong must themselves be evil. They also have no hesitation in mocking any thought of God, especially a God who is holy and might demand change in their lives. Paul tells Timothy similar things about people even within the church in the last days. He says this in chapter 3 of 2 Timothy, verses 1 to 5. But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty. For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Avoid such people. Sadly, the people of Israel at that time prided their ability to drink copious amounts of alcohol and to party till all hours. And of course the result of all this is further injustice. Bribery can change a verdict and set a guilty man free. It can also ensure an innocent man is convicted and punished. And of course this makes further mockery of the Holy One of Israel. And Isaiah says that God's judgment will indeed come, and it will be swift and complete. It's going to take much discipline, pain and suffering before God's anger is satisfied. But at this point, his hand is stretched out still. And finally in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 26 to 30, we read this. He will raise a signal for nations far away and whistle for them from the ends of the earth. And behold, quickly, speedily they come. None is weary, none stumbles, none slumbers or sleeps. Not a waistband is loose, not a sandal strap broken. Their arrows are sharp, all their bows bent. Their horses' hooves seem like flint, and their wheels like the whirlwind. Their roaring is like a lion, like young lions they roar. They growl and seize their prey. They carry it off, and none can rescue. They will growl over it on that day like the growling of the sea. And if one looks to the land, behold darkness and distress, and the light is darkened by its clouds. God will indeed hear the demand of the people to see evidence of God's actions. God will raise up an army of pagans to destroy his people. And again, this is very important to understand, especially for those who are prophetic, who have a prophetic call in their lives. If you're looking at the disturbing things happening in our world, you see, unless we believe that Satan and his minions are more powerful than God, and if we believe that God alone directs the affairs of the earth, even using Satan for his purposes, then we will fail. If we don't believe this, then we'll fail to apprehend rightly the things taking place in our world. If God used pagan nations to discipline his people in the time of Isaiah, we shouldn't be surprised that he continues to use pagan nations, pagan government, and all manner of ungodly people to bring about his purpose and plan in the earth today. He will use such people to bring his discipline to believers. Remember, Isaiah is prophesying to God's people, not to pagan nations. It is the people of God who need discipline and judgment because they are failing to produce the fruit of righteousness. Still, as God's people, the church, we can also expect discipline for our failure to obey God and produce fruit according to holiness. John 15 verses 1 to 11 says this, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean, because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me, and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. And so we get the sense from John's Gospel, Jesus' words to John, that the whole purpose of God's discipline is actually so that we bear fruit, and so that we may experience more fully the love of the Lord, that we might abide in his presence and enjoy his goodness all the days of our life and the eternal life that he has on offer for us. So I'd encourage you, do not reject the Lord's discipline, but learn to rejoice in it, knowing that this discipline will produce a harvest of good fruit in our lives. God bless you.